Okay, welcome back to the show, everyone. Today we have a second-year medical student guest on the show. His name is Maxim Polkesky. I'll let him correct me after I introduce him. He's in Berlin at the University of the way they say it is Charité University Berlin. Charité University Medicine Berlin. He's obsessed with preventative medicine and health optimization acquired by means of practicing holistic approaches like diet, exercise, sunlight. And he's also the host of his own podcast called Sapiens Playground, which I love that name, by the way.
Thank you thanks a lot.
You're welcome. So to kick it off, why don't you tell us how you found yourself in this space?
Well, first of all, hello everyone, and thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I was very happy to come up with that name. Like everyone can see it probably, Sapiens Playground. It was that wasn't your original question, but just maybe because just on my mind. It was inspired by the work of Brian Sanders for one reason, because he basically is always talking about the sapient diet, and I love that framework because it's trying to move away from that, from all these diet camps that exists, from veganism, ketogenic diets, carnivore, all these things, and trying to just look at things from an evolutionary standpoint of where we've come from and what's just best from us, and not basically following one specific diet and reducing yourself to that one specific camp. And so that's the word sapiens and playground, because I think play is super important for everyone, and because I think we should all stay children in some sense and don't lose the sense of play. And I think life should be much more fun than we are trying to make it. We're trying to make it worse than it is, I suppose. And so if we try to find pleasure in like tiny moments and laugh more and just have more fun, I think everyone will be just better around people.
So beautifully said. Anytime that I feel some stress coming on or feel that I have something to do that I don't want to do, I always reframe it into thinking like, oh, I'm just playing here. Like I'm playing adult, or I'm playing whatever my role is in this situation. And from a spiritual perspective, I think at the end of the day, we're just meant to be here, have a playful time, collaborate with others, and enjoy ourselves. Like I don't think we're supposed to be so uptight and stressed out all the time. So yeah, completely agree. Play is so important and paramount in achieving your highest health state. And
actually that's also one of the reasons why how I came to the things that I'm now interested in. So coming to your actual question that you asked in the beginning. So it has actually to do with the framework of playing, because it's what I realized later, but let me maybe tell where I'm coming from in the beginning. Like what is interesting about, or maybe it's not even that interesting about my story, because I have actually not anything special or crazy to tell. So like most of people that I find talking to in the health space that we are in, basically, they, as far as I can tell, they came to realize all these things that maybe have gone wrong, and to find their way through this mess by actually suffering serious illness. And then they discovered what works for them. And so that's why they became so obsessed with health. That is my impression of how it is the case for most people that I was talking to and that I'm following, basically. So it's always like that background story. I suffered that illness, and then I tried all different kinds of diets, and then I found that one thing, and I became the healthiest person alive, but that was never the case for me. So I've always been healthy. I don't have any medical conditions, like anything. I'm just a normal human being, I guess, as it's supposed to be, in some sense. So I cannot I really can't name anything that I'm suffering about. So I suppose that's a good thing, though.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
Right. And so probably the reason I've been starting to get interested in all these things is, first of all, it seems that I have some sense of natural skepticism. Maybe it was conveyed by some of the best teachers I had in school. So I'm really grateful to some of the teachers I had in school, because they actually taught me that skill of critical thinking and kind of questioning things all the time, like going through life with the question of why is it this way, why is it not the other way, why is it that, and why is it not something else, and why does it have to be this way, right? Exactly. And also challenging the narrative. So that's maybe why it was easier for me to ask these questions in the first place, right? And so I was basically doing learning. Oh, how do you say that? It's not, you have these ways of learning. You have, most people learn by experience something bad, and then they know that they should not repeat that because it leads to a bad outcome. And then you do something which leads to a good outcome, and then you learn that you should do that more often because it leads to a good outcome. And so I decided to take a different approach. It's like looking what other people do, see that everyone suffers. So everyone is suffering. Why is everyone suffering? And maybe that was that approach that I was coming from. Seeing everyone suffer and asking myself, what can I do to mitigate that? Because I'm in pretty good shape. I can help other people because I have the ability to help other people, because I have the physical abilities, because I have the strength, and because I'm not suffering anything serious. So I can help other people. And that's where my motivation came to become a medical student. And that was actually a very long time ago that I decided to enroll in medical school. And so, then I've been confronted with the whole cholesterol story. I don't even remember how that started. It had something to do with my dad, because he was taking statins, and I was just researching some things, and my mom always told me that eggs are bad, and I was thinking, like, how on earth can they be bad? Like, this just doesn't make sense. And if something doesn't make sense to me, then I'm researching it to death, like absolutely, falling down an endless rabbit hole and never coming out of it again. So that's how my life basically is when I'm getting obsessed with a topic. So
you need more people like that.
Maybe. Yeah, probably we do. And so that's where I'm at now. And I'm trying my best to not get too caught up in certain ideologies, basically, to get too dogmatic, because I've been in all camps. I've been in all camps, and that's why I'm finding myself more and more drawn to that middle ground of looking at all things and trying to get the best of all worlds, basically. And so I've been in that camp of being obsessed with eating tons of vegetables. I was convinced that that's the best thing to go.
I've been there
and
too.
I was having gut issues. I was developing some gut issues. Like I had very serious bloating. And then I moved away from that a little bit, and I transitioned. I didn't really transition to anything. I wasn't vegan at any point of time. I wasn't vegetarian. I was never keto. I was nothing. I'm like experimenting with different things. I'm shifting my diet here and there. I was and probably still am pretty low carb-ish, I would say. So I've been researching that whole low carb ketogenic space. Then I've been researching that whole carnivore space. So I've been in all of these camps, but I always forced myself out of it again in order to not get caught in dogma, because there's, I would say, it's pretty dangerous to get caught from, for various reasons, and which,
I continually find that with myself too. Every time I get caught in dogma and I find my way out of it, I'm just like, Natasha, please don't get caught up in that again.
Yes. And you get wiser through that, because you learn to, it's a very fascinating thing, actually, to get caught in something and then move out of it again, because you realize that something was able to basically, sort of
influence you.
I'm not finding the right word, the precise word that
Persuade, influence, take a
basically,
hold.
yes, persuade is a good word.
Mhm.
And so then you take the scientific approach of critically asking questions, even questioning your own belief. And that's a very difficult step to do. And most of people are not able to take that step. And that's what scientists do. And I think that's actually coming back to the word playground, because playground means you're not serious about staying in dogma. You like exploring, right? Like seeing what
beautiful.
you're like a kid. You want to explore. You want to know what's true and what's not, what's actually going on, and you want explanation for what's happening. And there's no point in getting caught in dogma, because that's not helping you in any way. That's just limiting your possibilities of actually learning more.
So true, yeah. And the way you pair it with, I like your concept of playground and how you described it in relation to exploring your own health and health optimization. That's really good. I like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. No, I think that that's a great introduction to why you're here. It's ultimately sounds like you found a calling of service to help others. And
yes.
And thank you.
Yeah, I agree. That's probably it. And I'm genuinely interested, as you said in the introductory words, that I'm absolutely obsessed with like helping people. I want to find out what helps, what is good for people. And it's very difficult because there's so much noise, right? There's so much to sort through. And it's, you're always asking yourself, and you always find yourself in that battle, and you don't want it to be a battle. It should be like, as I said, it should be like playground. We're all exploring. We all don't know. And scientists, a good scientist always says, I don't know. Like that's what a good scientist is always saying. I actually don't know. And I can make a hypothesis. And I had Nick Norwitz back in the day on my podcast, and I love his approach because he was explaining exactly that. Like as a scientist, you always come up with a hypothesis, and then you can test it. And you actually, the way you go about things is to try to refuse that hypothesis. So you never try to prove anything in science. You try to refuse certain hypotheses. And then if you sort out things, then you come up with a model, like the thing that's left over. That's how it could be. And then you look if things fit into that model. And if they fit, then you use that model to explain certain phenomena in nature, or like in biology or whatever, right? So if things do not fit, then okay, what's the step then? Then the next step would be either we remodel that whole thing, or we construct an entirely new model. Like we need to do something about it. And that's the problem with dogma and ideological thinking, because you have the problem with ideology is you're so trapped in that ideology that everything that does not fit into your model, you can turn it in a way that it suddenly fits again. And so doesn't like, maybe you've realized, like, no matter what argument you put forward to a vegan person or even a keto person, they will find a way to turn it around so that it suddenly supports their argument. You've been like, how on earth does that happen? Right? And it's very difficult to stay objective in that regard.
No, that's a really great example. I didn't quite grasp where you were coming from with that, but with that example, it definitely helps me solidify what you're saying. Yeah, don't get trapped in dogma. Really important.
I try my best not to.
Yeah, same here. It's hard though. It's hard, but it
is. Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty difficult, and you find yourself, and I think there is you need to give the devil its due. Like there is some evolutionary explanation for why we're so easily being trapped in ideological group mentality, because that's how we survived evolution. Like obviously that's the case how we go about, because if you look at the human being, that's actually a very interesting thing that I was thinking about recently. Like if you look at human being, we are very weak. Our body is very fragile. We're very vulnerable. We walk upwards. Our most vulnerable parts of our body are directly exposed to, right, to attack.
True.
So actually, we on our own would not be able to survive revolution at all. Like our strength comes with that whole group mentality and basically working in a group, cooperating with other people.
Right.
That's why we are, why we have that insane ability of communicating with other people, and we always try to build networks, and we have that globalization, and we're all interconnected. Like no other animal does that. And it's our crazy strength that helped us to survive through evolution. So obviously we seek niches and groups and people who are on our side and support us, because that's the only way how we were able to survive up until that point.
Yeah, it's also a big reason why our mental health is often inextricably tied to our social life. We will fall into a depression if we're locked in the same four walls for lengths at a time.
That's not preaching too far away from maybe, I don't want to talk too much about it, but that's sort of what's happening right now. I'm very concerned about it.
Yeah,
because that's something which will manifest later down the road. Like people do not die and suffer from depression here and now. Well, they suffer from depression or like psychological strain here and now, but the real consequences, they get visible in years,
later on,
maybe 20, 30, whatever years. And if a generation of kids, we're not using any words, so nobody can censor us, okay? if a generation of kids grows up with the being convinced that seeing another human being, is dangerous in some sense, that you should keep distance, that you should, cover your face, that hugging each other is bad.
Right.
You're a bad person for hugging your grandma. That's bad.
Yeah.
Like if such a generation now grows up and people lose that feeling of social interaction, I think we will see some serious consequences of that in, I don't know how many years, like 10, 20, 30? That's a risk we're taking right now.
Probably even sooner. Probably
even sooner. Sure.
I feel like we're seeing it right now, and it's frightening.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about the coming generation.
Same.
Children.
Yeah, same. It's yeah. I want to give them a hug. But,
yeah, like absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why I'm genuinely trying to spread as much positivity as possible, even though that's not easy. When you see what's happening, like how can you not get angry about it?
I know, but don't.
It's so difficult, right?
Yeah. But that's only adding to the lower vibration.
Exactly.
Frequency.
That's it.
Yeah. So you're giving them your spirit, whereas that's exactly what they want.
Sort of. Yeah. And that's not losing, and that's not solving the actual problem, and it's maybe even making it worse if you add to that negativity.
Exactly.
So that's why it's a very difficult decision to make. If do I want to try to show people what's going on and try to be kind of a little bit rageful to just make people aware of the seriousness of that problem, or do I want to leave that topic behind altogether and just try to spread positive vibes and tell them that life goes on and that they should be able to take responsibility of their own lives and make it better? What am I to do? It's hard.
Right. Lead by example, I say, and lead with positivity. Yeah. I think good always wins.
In the end it does.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Same. Likewise. All right. So shifting gears a little bit, let's jump into matters of the heart. And Maxim, I'm going to kick it off with a little bit of a spiritual quote from one of my favorite books, The Untethered Soul. Here it goes. Your heart is one of the masterpieces of creation. It is a phenomenal instrument. It has the potential to create vibrations and harmonies that are far beyond the beauty of pianos, strings, or flutes. You can hear an instrument, but you feel your heart. And if you think you feel an instrument, it's only because it touched your heart. Your heart is an instrument made of extremely subtle energy that few people come to appreciate. In most human beings, the heart does its work unattended. Even though its behavior governs the course of our lives, it is not understood. If at any given point in time the heart happens to open, we fall in love. If at any given point in time it happens to close, the love stops. If the heart happens to hurt, we get angry. And if we stop feeling it altogether, we get empty. All of these different things happen because the heart goes through changes. These energy shifts and variations that take place in the heart run your life. You are so identified with them that you use the words I and me when you refer to what's going on in your heart. But in truth, you are not your heart. You are the experiencer of your heart. So that's just a little bit more of a spiritual message to kick it off. But with you, I'd love to dive more into the biological aspect of our heart.
Well,
so
where should I start on that topic? It's a very, very deep rabbit hole that we can go into.
I know. Some areas that I'd love to touch on are
Right.
atherosclerosis, the pathophysiology of the heart, and cholesterol as well.
Okay.
So maybe
well,
like some misunderstandings or
yes,
yeah.
yes. I'm just trying, like, okay, let me tell people what atherosclerosis maybe is
Yeah,
in the beginning.
absolutely.
So if probably people have an idea of what that phenomenon constitutes. So it's basically, it describes the process of narrowing and hardening of the arteries. So if we have a pathological basically transformation of the artery wall, so it's not like plaque somehow builds up inside of the bloodstream, so to speak, and on the inner side of the artery wall. It's like literally inside of the wall. And so we have buildup of plaque in some sense. And then it can get stiff over time. It gets calcified with calcium. And now most people think that the artery starts getting more narrower and narrower, and suddenly there's no space for the blood to flow through.
Right.
And so now if that's what people think, I'm coming to explain that that's not actually what leads to how is it?
Atherosclerosis.
Yeah, what the final event is, like a stroke.
Oh yeah.
For instance, right? Or a heart attack.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually lead to the heart attack, to the final event. And so people think it gets super narrow and then the blood flow is restricted, for instance, to the heart. We have like arteries that supply the heart with nutrients and oxygen and stuff. And so if one of them is blocked, then people think that that is a heart attack. But actually what happens most of the time, that can happen in very rare circumstances. Most of the time, you have that plaque buildup, which is, by the way, not a continuous plaque, that goes through the entire system of arteries and basically through the entire body. It's like in certain spots we have like these massive plaque buildups, which is a different thing that I'm maybe going to more into later.
Right.
But for now, what can happen if we have that massive plaque buildup at certain areas and places in the arteries, then that plaque can rupture if it's too big. And if we maybe imagine you have an old man, and that old man has some massive plaque in his coronary arteries. That's the arteries that supply the heart, basically. And so you've got some plaque there, and it's already narrowed, to some extent. And now he engages maybe in some heavy physical activity, suddenly that plaque ruptures. That might happen actually. And now it's the question, where does it travel? It can travel to the coronary arteries and get stuck in that plaque. Now, because that area gets exposed, the artery wall gets exposed to blood. A thrombus starts to build, and that's basically a blood clot. And that blood clot, together with the plaque, cannot travel down the road and get stuck somewhere down the road. If that's in the brain, we have a stroke. If that's in a coronary artery, we got a heart attack. That's what happens most of the time.
Okay.
And so the mainstream narrative is, we have a certain level of cholesterol in the blood. we have a certain level of LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol in the blood. Okay, so that's now coming from a different side. Now talking about cholesterol.
Yes.
What's cholesterol? The liver makes cholesterol. The liver actually makes all of the cholesterol. If you eat cholesterol, the liver makes a bit less, but the liver still makes most of the cholesterol that the body needs.
Okay.
And so I think there's like so much information on what you need cholesterol for. So, but I'm still going to list some of the function of it, because people still, I feel like most people think that it's an evil substance that we actually don't need, that damages our heart in some sense. So we need it for vitamin D production. Actually, vitamin D is made out of cholesterol. Then bile acids to absorb fat that you eat. And together with the fat, you actually absorb fat-soluble vitamins. You need bile acids for that, and these bile acids are made of cholesterol. Okay. So now then, cholesterol is part of every cell membrane. So every cell membrane needs cholesterol for its structure, for the cell membrane fluidity. That's important for different functions of the cell. Okay, so what else have we got? Yeah, one of the most important things, all the hormones, all the sex hormones, cortisol, and all the steroid hormones that our body makes, they are made from cholesterol. Okay, maybe there's some more functions, but that come to my mind right now, out of the top of my head.
Excellent.
And so now that's why cholesterol is actually a good thing. So we should not be afraid of it in the first place, because we need it, and without it we would die. And so if we think about it, our body makes all of it basically. If you don't need any, your body makes all of it. So what does that mean? It's not essential. Like vegans would say, it's not essential. So that means it's not important. I'm telling like, no. If it's not essential, it means that it's even more important, because it's so crucial that the body could not survive a second without producing cholesterol. That's why it needed to rely to an endogenous production of cholesterol all the time. And now all the essential things, they are actually not that important, because essential means the body cannot make it. You need to get it from the food you eat.
I see.
And so if you get it from the food you eat, it means that if you fast and you don't get some food, it's not that big of an issue if you don't get some of these vitamins. You can survive without like eating vitamin B12 for a couple of days, maybe for a couple of weeks. That's not the big of a problem. If you don't have cholesterol for a couple of weeks, you'll die. If you don't have it for a minute, you will die. So that's why it's so important.
Wow.
So that's what why I want to flip the understanding in people's head of essential, not essential.
I see.
Because essential means we cannot produce it, and not essential means we can produce it. And for me, that means if we can produce it, that means to me that it's so important that the body has to produce it by itself. Okay.
No, that's a beautiful explanation.
Yes, and that's maybe a slight paradigm shift, but just that tells me that cholesterol is very, very, very important, of very big importance to the body. And now we have cholesterol is a fatty substance, and oil and water doesn't mix. And so cholesterol is like fat, and it doesn't mix with water, and blood is mostly water. And so what do we have to carry cholesterol through the blood, because it would clump, and so we don't want that to happen in our blood. And we have these carrier proteins, these ships. You can imagine blood is like lake, a sea, whatever, a river, and then you have these ships that are called LDL or HDL or chylomicrons. That's like that whole complicated system of lipoproteins. I'm not going too deep into that, because it's very complicated metabolism that's actually going on with the liver and the gut and all these things. We're going to focus on LDL and HDL.
Okay.
So LDL is, and among other things, LDL and HDL are the most important carriers of cholesterol.
Okay.
Although that is not entirely correct, because as I said, cholesterol is in the cell membranes of every cell, and you have a huge number of red blood cells in your blood, like an insane number of red blood cells. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's mind-boggling. I don't know the exact number, but every second you produce like a ridiculous number of red blood cells every second. So it's crazy.
Wow.
And so red blood cells are much, much bigger than the LDL. Okay, so LDL is really tiny. In comparison to an LDL, a red blood cell is huge.
Okay.
And so they have a cell membrane. There are cells. They're red blood cells. And so these cell membranes have cholesterol. So red blood cells by default have a bunch of cholesterol in their cell membranes. So this way you could actually say that, okay, like not only LDL and HDL carry cholesterol, but we have actually, for instance, cells in the blood, like the red blood cells, that also have a bunch of cholesterol in their cell membranes. And that might be important in the discussion of where the cholesterol in the plaques actually comes from.
Okay.
But
We're getting there.
We get in there, right? I'm just needed to explain some basics that people understand the terms that I'm using.
Absolutely.
And so people confuse LDL cholesterol with the actual LDL molecule. If you measure, if you take a blood test, if your doctor takes a blood test, and it says LDL-C, it stands for LDL cholesterol, and that describes the amount of cholesterol in all of the LDL particles. So it's not the same thing.
Okay.
It's like the LDL is the ship and the cholesterol is the passenger.
Okay, I see.
Right? And so if you count all the passengers on the LDL ship, then that's the LDL cholesterol that you see on your blood test.
Okay.
And if you count all the passengers on the HDL ships, then that's the HDL cholesterol on the blood test.
Okay, got it.
Okay, right. And so if we want to get an idea of how many LDL molecules we actually have in our blood, then we would need to make a so-called Apob test. So what's Apob? That's a protein that's attached to that ship. So we have the LDL, that's the ship. We have cholesterol and, by the way, also like triglycerides and other things and fat soluble vitamins and whatnot in the LDL. And so we have a protein attached to the LDL, and that's called Apob. And that protein is necessary so that the LDL is recognized by the liver and is being taken up again. And now, having said all that, I'm now coming to explain what the medical mainstream narrative is of what causes atherosclerosis, basically. And the favorite example of the medical community is to use a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia to describe that LDL is maybe and probably, and that's what they say, the most relevant and sufficient, that means LDL alone is enough to initiate and cause atherosclerosis. Okay, that doesn't mean, and there's a consensus on the fact that there are lots of different risk factors. Okay, so we know like diabetes is a risk factor, smoking is a risk factor. I don't know, like blood clotting issues are risk factors. Did I say smoking? Yeah, I said smoking. Alcohol consumption is a risk factor. Stress is a risk factor. Like you have all these bunch of risk factors, but in some sense, for them, it all boils down to that LDL molecule.
Okay.
And that's where things stop to make sense to me. Because if we say, that's what I mentioned at the very beginning with the model. We propose a model, it's LDL. All right, fair enough. Now, how do all the other things fit into that model? Please explain it to me, right? And I'm thinking, okay, they're not trying to come up with all these weird ways of, modifying that model. Are you familiar with the work of Malcolm Kendrick, by the way?
I'm not.
Have you heard of him, maybe?
No, I don't think I have.
Okay. So Malcolm Kendrick is actually a guy that I'm a big fan of Malcolm Kendrick, I must say, because he's also one of these people he's a doctor, and he's skeptical of the idea that LDL is the causal factor, the most important causal factor in atherosclerosis. And he's written a great book, and he has a blog and he posts a lot of things there. And he was on several podcasts, so people can look him up. He's written a great book that's called The Clot Thickens, where he lays down his hypothesis. And where's he coming from? He said it very beautifully. You can imagine as if you trying to make a puzzle, right? And that's basically the model through which we are trying to explain the development of atherosclerosis. We're trying to make that puzzle, okay? And so now the medical community decided to take two pieces of that puzzle, which is LDL and macrophages, and they eat the LDL, and then we have foam cells. It doesn't really matter, but okay. Or three pieces of that puzzle. They said to take three pieces of that, or four, whatever piece of that puzzle, put it in the middle and say that's where they belong to. They have to be there. And so now things don't fit, and they'd be like, what do we do now? We need to. So we could try to, I don't know, to make them fit, but actually the puzzle won't be right. It wouldn't look like a real puzzle.
Right, right.
Or the scientific approach would actually be, we need to come up with a new model, with something that is able to explain everything. And I loved the work of Malcolm Kendrick in that regard, because that's exactly where he's coming from. He's saying, well, we have all these risk factors, and we have all these phenomena which stand in the way of that lipid hypothesis. That's, by the way, how the medical community call that hypothesis of LDL being causal and basically causing atherosclerosis, the lipid hypothesis.
Okay.
And yeah, so there are many things that's standing in the way, and Malcolm Kendrick is thinking like, okay, what's the actual underlying process? Let's look at the process and let's see if we can find a process which will make everything fit beautifully. And of everything that I have seen up until that point, I find his work the most promising. I would say. Yes, and all right, so coming back to what the medical community actually says. It's like we have a certain level of LDL in your blood, because LDL is very important. It carries cholesterol and other things. It's not a bad player. It's something we need. It's something that our body actually produces. And it's, again, it's an insane number of molecules. It's not like you have 5 LDL molecules floating around. It's like a ridiculous number of 10 to the power of, I don't know, 10, something along those lines, like a ridiculous number of molecules of LDL, and the liver produces them all the time. And so if they're so evil, does that mean the body produces a substance that is actually supposed to be killing you? Well, that doesn't make sense from the very beginning, right?
Nope.
Right, and so there has something else to be going on, at least. If we say, okay, does LDL even play a role? Well, if it does, then there must be still something pathological going on before the LDL might even play some role in it. It's like what the medical community suggests is that you have your arteries and you have a certain LDL level, which is normal, let's say. And so if your LDL level rises, then it just accumulates in your artery wall. Well, it's not that easy, obviously. And there are factors that can make this happen more often. Like, for instance, they all agree upon the fact that diabetes goes along with a high blood sugar level. That can be damaging for the arteries. Right. So that means that more LDL can get trapped there. But they still all are pretty much in agreement that LDL on its own is sufficient to somehow get into the artery wall, get stuck there, and initiate atherosclerosis. And so that doesn't make any sense, because then we need to ask another question. Well, how does the LDL get there? And so maybe that gets a little bit technical, but that's a very important piece of the puzzle, because now I'm not really interested in that model anymore. I want to see what the process is. What is actually the things that we know, and what conclusions can we draw from them? So we know we have a layer inside of the artery wall that's made up of epithelial cells, and it's called the endothelium. Okay. And it's a 1-cell layer, and below that we have different other layers. Like down the road, we have a smooth muscle layer of smooth muscle cells, which is important for for vasoconstriction, where the artery gets narrower, and vasodilatation, where it gets a bit wider. And so that's what we need the smooth muscle cells for, to regulate blood pressure. Okay. And so we have different layers. And the first layer, which the blood is exposed to, is the endothelial layer. Okay, it's a 1-cell layer, as I said. And so but that's not it. Many people think that that's how the artery wall kind of protects itself from the stuff that's floating around in the blood. But actually, we have another layer of protection, which is on top of the endothelial layer, and that's called the glycocalyx. And so many doctors haven't even known of that term, glycocalyx, or they have heard of that term, but they have quickly forgot it because it's not mentioned too often in medical school, I must admit. Right, and it's sort of, as Malcolm Kendrick actually describes it, what makes a fish slipping out of your hands. right? So the fish also on top of it, the fish has a tiny glycocalyx, which makes it very slippery. Exactly. And so that's a similar phenomenon inside of our blood vessels, which makes them super smooth. And that's a very important layer, basically, because it creates some space between the endothelial layer and all the components of the blood. So that's one barrier. Now, if we think about it, if we just follow the logic of the medical community, let's follow an LDL, which goes from the blood into the wall. And then we also need to ask the question, why LDL? Why not like every other constituent of the blood? Like if LDL can go there, why not anything else?
Yeah.
Like why doesn't like anything else get stuck there? Why like LDL? Okay, but the LDL needs to somehow make its way through the glycocalyx, and now it's here at the endothelial cells. Now the endothelial cells are very close to each other. They're like houses standing wall to wall, and nothing can actually come through because they are connected through things that are called tight junctions. And as the name implies, they're like super, super tight. Nothing comes through. Not even like ions. It's like single atoms. You need special channels, like a sodium potassium pump or a calcium pump or whatever, like which allows for atoms to go through. It's an atom, and you have a whole sphere, like a giant sphere in comparison to an atom. It's an LDL. It has no chance of actually leaking, as they say, through this tight junction. So this is impossible.
Okay.
And if we didn't have these tight junctions, we would absolutely die, because because not even an atom can go through. So what if it's loose and everything from the blood can just spill through that tight junction? You can imagine that bad things might happen from that.
Right.
That's another layer of protection. That's a very strong layer of protection, actually, all these tight junctions. And so if we just try to follow the logic, and then the next thing would be, which the medical community proposes, is that the LDL is actually taken up by the endothelial cell. Like it's a cell, it can actively take up things, and that's called, by the way, that's called endocytosis. So taking up things. And if it like releases things out of the cell, that's called exocytosis.
Exo, got it.
Right. And so the cell can basically do endocytosis, take up an LDL.
Okay.
Then it would have to actively transport that LDL through the cell to the other end and release it there again actively, because that's not going to be a passive transport and not going to be a passive process. Because you need some transport system to take up a molecule. You need some transport system in the cell. It's actually very complicated to transport it through that cell. And again, we have lots of stuff going on to just release that molecule again.
So
and
this,
so
this is essentially what the medical community is proposing, right?
Well, that's if we just follow their logic.
So
if we say LDL goes through the wall and gets stuck there, then that's what it would have to do. It would have to cross the glycocalyx. It would have to cross the tight junctions, or the cell would have to do that process that I just described.
I see.
That's what would need to happen. Like there's no other way around it. How can LDL, how else could it end up inside of the artery wall? And so if we say, let's say that that's the case, fair enough. Okay, that might happen. Then why is the body so stupid? Why? Like, why does it engage in an active process of transporting an LDL through the blood into the wall, releasing it there, so that plaques build up, so that we die eventually of a heart attack?
I can't imagine
that doesn't make sense.
Right. Through all these years of evolution, that's how we evolved.
Exactly. And so, especially that must have been an active process of taking up LDL and releasing it out, because active process means it requires energy. Anything that's actively transported through the cell requires some energy. And so this just cannot be the case. And so there's an alternative hypothesis. We have like blood vessels, tiny blood vessels that supply the cells of the blood vessel. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Because
Yes,
if you imagine these big, you have the small blood vessels, the walls are thin enough so that nutrients can actually be taken up from the bloodstream. Okay. But the large, thick arteries, like the aorta, like all these big arteries, or also the coronary arteries, the very big ones, with thick walls. The walls are actually too thick. So there's an additional blood supply from outside.
Okay.
Of tiny, really tiny blood vessels that are called vasa vasorum, which literally means blood vessels of the blood vessels.
Oh, wow.
And so, there's that argument that, well, it might happen that now the LDL comes from the other side. So it's not coming from the bloodstream inside of the artery, but from these tiny vessels, vasa vasorum. And so that's a reasonable argument. Why not? Why shouldn't it come from the other side and accumulate in the artery wall? All right. Now, there's a problem though. It's the problem that veins have more vasa vasorum than arteries. And there is no atherosclerosis in veins. None, like zero. There's no case and it's impossible. It never happens, never. Unless you do a bypass surgery. So basically take out a vein from the leg, for instance, and you put the vein inside of an artery. That's like a procedure that's being done if a person has extensive atherosclerosis. And so you put a vein in an artery, then that vein can develop atherosclerosis.
I see.
Right? But the vein itself, the venous system itself never ever develops atherosclerosis.
Okay.
It does not happen.
Okay.
Even though it's exposed to the exact same constituents of the blood.
Fascinating.
So, and that's an interesting question. Like, if LDL is sufficient, then why does not the same thing happen in veins?
Right.
Whatever the process is, if LDL is sufficient, it has to happen in veins.
Yeah.
There's no other way around it because the vein, the blood in the vein has the exact same amount of LDL. And if LDL is to blame, it should happen in veins.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's where I see the model, it's a bit shaky. And I'm not saying that I know the answer. I'm just saying there are things that don't make sense. And now I'm trying to find a model or some explanations that just do make more sense to me. And so I hope that's not too technical and that people are still following.
No, it's wonderful.
And as I said in the beginning, that's a very deep rabbit hole. I can actually talk for hours. Like, I have funny story aside to maybe loosen up that atmosphere. I have a good friend. And I'm like very fascinated and enthusiastic about that topic. And so I need someone to talk about it. So I'm actually glad that I have the opportunity to do that here. Because I also can go through all of that and see if that makes sense or not.
We're gonna learn a lot in this episode.
Right. And so there were like certain, I've been meeting up with that friend and I've been telling him all that. And I've been actually, and exactly the way I'm telling that to you right now. And he's like listening and trying to be polite and not say anything that would, make me sad that maybe he's not that interested in what I'm telling him. And last time we were like meeting up with some other medical students, and someone asked me about, I don't remember what the exact question was, but something, it had to do something with cholesterol and atherosclerosis. And he was like, oh no, please don't start, please not. Like, please, because he knew what was coming. Because if I started to talk about it, like it's an endless rabbit hole, would never finish.
Yeah, it's like when you meet a new person, you're like, where are they in these sort of topics? And is this something I could talk about with them? And you kind of like give them teasers to see how they respond. And if they respond positively, then you're just like off to the races. You're like, and then you're just like so excited to have someone to talk to about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, coming back to the story, other things that would not make sense is if you compare like different countries and their levels of cholesterol. There's not a real relationship like between, or there are just too many examples of countries where it's epidemiology. Fair enough. But if it's one of the most important risk factors, we would see some like difference. I could bring up the example of smoking. Okay, so if we agree upon that smoking is one of the most important risk factors for lung cancer, then it would be very weird to compare two countries, and in one country people smoke more than the other country, but we would not see higher numbers of lung cancer in that country. You know what I'm saying? And so we have just too many black swans. You have too many black swans where things don't fit up, where people, and now coming for instance to the familial hypercholesterolemia story, it's where patients have a mutation in the gene that produces, so the genes code for proteins, for people that are maybe not familiar with genetics. Genes are basically blueprints for proteins that are made in our body.
Okay.
And so there's a mutation in FH, so familial hypercholesterolemia. You know, to not say that term over and over again, I'm just going to refer to it as FH.
Got it.
So in FH, there's a mutation in the gene that codes for the receptor that sits on the liver to take up LDL.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if there's a mutation in that gene, that means that can mean many things. That can mean that the receptor still functions very well. Then probably nothing happens, and then we would not refer to it as FH. What happens in FH is that the receptor either doesn't function as well as it should, which means it does not recognize LDL well. Okay.
Okay.
So if an LDL floats around and it wants to dock to the receptor, the liver says, I don't really know who you are. Like, it's more difficult. And so the another option would be that it's mutated so much that it basically does not recognize the LDL at all, or very, very poorly. And so that's the reason why in FH patients have, they can have absolutely astronomical levels of LDL.
I see.
Really, like, if you just to give an example, if a normal person would have an LDL level of, like, say between 100 and 200, would be the ballpark of what most people would fall into probably, then in FH you could see levels above 600, 700, 800, closer to 1,000.
Wow.
And so that happens rarely, like the levels over 1,000, but then you have a very strong mutation, which basically means that the liver is not able to recognize the LDL and more keeps floating around.
It's like a person with dementia who doesn't recognize their family.
Yeah, maybe that's a way to frame it. Right? Because the Apob, the structure of the Apob protein that sits on the LDL ship, that structure is it's also coded by a gene, by the way, by a different gene, but it's made so that it perfectly fits into that LDL receptor.
Okay.
And so it's like a key in the lock. Maybe that's a better example.
Okay.
And so now if you have that key, that's the Apob, and the lock is the receptor.
Okay.
So imagine the lock is a bit like different, and in one example, you maybe can press the key into that lock and it still works. But another example, it just doesn't fit no matter what you do.
Okay. Okay.
And so that's what can happen in FH basically. And so they're a subset, and a relatively large subset of FH patients. They develop extensive atherosclerosis at a very, very young age.
Wow.
And so that's the favorite argument of the medical community, basically, to say, see, we have like a subset of patients, or we have a phenomenon, a genotype, where people have only higher LDL, and yet, you see that leads to atherosclerosis, and they have no other risk factors.
I see.
And fair enough. But the problem I have with that is that medical community is very good at conflating pathophysiological mutations, things that are not normal, with normal physiology. Most of the people who develop atherosclerosis don't have FH. They don't have these mutations. So maybe there is something going on which we do not clearly understand in the FH model, but I'm not sure if we can really use that example to prove LDL as being the most important risk factor for people who don't have mutations, because that's a different thing. Like, the whole metabolism of lipoproteins is wrecked in FH patients. It's not working properly because the LDL is not being able to be recognized by the liver. Like, how do we know? And oftentimes there are also other mutations
Okay.
going on in FH. So not only the mutation of the LDL receptor, but actually other mutations aside from the mutation of the LDL receptor. And there's been actually an interesting study made, which did the following thing. And I actually want really people to understand that. So I hope people are listening, still listening. They divided the FH patients in two groups. And so they divided them into one group, which developed heart disease and showed up with heart attacks and atherosclerosis at a certain age. Like, I don't remember the exact details.
Okay.
And so the other group, which didn't have heart disease. And so they basically split them up in those who had FH and had heart disease, and those who also had FH but didn't have heart disease.
Interesting.
And so they wanted to compare what's different between them. Like, can we find any difference? And so the idea would be maybe, okay, like if the LDL hypothesis is true, you would probably find higher LDL levels in those with FH and with heart disease. Well, that was not the case. So there was no difference in LDL. There was a difference though in clotting factors. So people with FH and heart disease had higher amounts of clotting factors floating around in their blood. And so I can, I'm not sure, I must admit, I haven't looked this exact thing up that I'm now going to talk about in a second, but Malcolm Kendrick described in his book that, and that makes total sense actually if you think about it evolutionary and biologically, that every system and probably every receptor and every molecule probably has multiple functions and not just one function. That would make sense, just so that the body's more efficient at using its resources.
More adaptable.
And so, exactly, right. And so what Malcolm Kendrick described in his book was that it seems like the LDL receptor has another function in addition to clearing LDL from the blood. It has the function to also clear up some of the clotting factors from the blood. As I said, like, I'm not sure to the extent to that this is true because I haven't looked it up. I still need to do that. But if that would be a possible explanation for why FH has got higher clotting factors, because if there is like a mutation in the LDL receptor, which doesn't allow the LDL receptor to recognize these clotting factors that it's supposed to take up, well, that would mean that we would end up with higher levels of clotting factors in a subset again. It's like we can have different mutations, and that could lead to different pathologies. Now I'm now talking about clotting factors, and that's basically what this theory of Malcolm Kendrick is based on. And I'm referring a lot to Malcolm Kendrick because that's what up until that day basically makes the most sense to me, and he lays it down beautifully on his blog. So everyone who wants to learn more about it, it's free, like everyone can read it. I'm not being paid for like anything. So,
yeah, I'll have to check him out.
I've bought his book, and I would suggest anyone to buy his book, but not because I get anything for that, just because I found it interesting. But if you want to read the exact same things that he explains in the book, then you can just go to his blog and read it for yourself. He actually lays it down beautifully on his blog.
Excellent. I'll link it in the show notes.
Right. It's I'm gonna send you the link
Thank you.
after the podcast. His book is called The Clot Thickens, and so it has to do with blood clotting, and that's basically his entire theory, because he says, okay, so if you look at the constituents of the actual plaque, right? People say like the plaque is full of cholesterol. Okay, so yes, there's a part of the plaque. Fair enough. Cholesterol is in the plaque, but that's actually not the only thing that's in the plaque. And if you look at the plaque, then you can actually make the case that the plaque could just as much be a blood clot in different stages of repair. So what Malcolm Kendrick basically says, a shortcut of his theory, is that we have damage to the arteries. That's kind of the most important thing. You could have clotting going on, but if you don't have damage to the arteries, to the endothelium itself, then the whole thing doesn't even initiate. So you have damage to the endothelial wall, endothelium, or to the glycocalyx by that regard, because the glycocalyx, as we explained, is another additional protective layer.
Yep.
And so if you're damaged to the artery wall, then what happens is that the blood gets in contact with the underlying layers of the artery wall. And that initiates actually the clotting cascade, because you don't want to bleed to death. And so the body has that beautiful intelligent system and it's super complicated. It's like nobody knows it all in its head. Like it's extremely complicated. There are many factors involved in blood clotting. It's actually super interesting. And so the body initiates blood clotting if the blood gets in contact with the wall, not with the endothelial cells, but if it's damaged and the blood gets direct contact with the collagen fibers actually below it, then it initiates that blood clotting cascade.
Okay.
And so what actually happens in a healthy person, we all have some sort of endothelial damage going on. Like that happens all the time. If you're otherwise healthy and you don't have repeated damage over and over again, like you smoke and you have particles traveling in the bloodstream that damage the endothelium, like it's pretty much what happens in smoking, all in air pollution, by the way. So you have these particles that end up in your blood and they damage the endothelium. Simple as that. And so if you have repeated damage okay, so first what happens if you don't have repeated damage? Then you have that clot, maybe that tiny clot, and then you have a process called fibrinolysis. So, okay, the clot consists in the end, you have fibrinogen, which connects to a net of fibrin. And so it's like the fibrin is where everything in the blood gets caught. And so you have that massive, thick, well, it's not massive, it can be small, clot being stuck there and actually, building a protective layer so that you don't bleed to death.
Okay.
If that happens on your skin, that clot eventually just falls off.
Right.
Okay, if you have that tiny little clot on your endothelial wall, then you have a process that actually other cells come and repair the wall and so on and so forth. But now if you have a process that's called fibrinolysis, which means actually lysis is like cutting, right? So you cut off that clot. Okay. So the clot disappears eventually, and you have again a beautiful smooth artery and nothing.
So this is our healthy folks. This is what's happening.
Well, that's all healthy folks. You have damage all the time. You have that repair system going on. If the repair system is fine, everything is good.
Nice.
Okay, so now if you have repeated damage, the body doesn't, and by the way, that damage doesn't happen everywhere, right? And that's what I alluded to in the very beginning, that you have the plaques in very specific spots. You don't have a continuous streak, going through your entire body.
I see.
Because if it's like only LDL, then we should have a continuous plaque, right? But it's like, no, there are spots where you don't have anything. And then there are spots where you have that massive plaque accumulation. What's going on there? It's on branch points oftentimes. Because in branch points, you have certain differences in how the blood flows, and that actually can create some damage to the glycocalyx, and by that also damage the endothelium. Okay. So you need to look at the blood flow. And by the way, shear stress is good for the endothelial cells. Shear stress is not the same thing as blood pressure, because blood pressure is the force that directed in that direction, and so shear stress is the force which goes that way. Okay. Basically, and that happens if you have a healthy person who has also a low heart rate. Then, in order to transport the same amount of blood, the heart pumps harder, right? And so you have more shear stress. Okay. So and shear stress increase. It's basically good. It happens as a reaction to exercising, by the way. Right. So it's increasing the blood flow in its normal direction. Exactly. And then if you exercise as an adaptive response, you have a decrease in the heart rate in the aftermath. Okay. Right. So that's how the body adapts to exercise. You have an increase in heart rate during exercise, but after that it falls, and over the long term it actually goes down. The resting heart rate lowers. Exactly. Excellent. So and that actually protects the blood vessels. One important molecule in that regard is nitric oxide, and that's that's the favorite molecule of Malcolm Kendrick. He's got like a funny funny quote. He's got a shirt which says, "Say yes to no," and no stands for nitric oxide.
Ah, I like it. I like it.
And so because he likes that molecule, he'll be like, yes, say yes to no, because nitric oxide is so cool. And nitric oxide gets released by the endothelial cells, by healthy endothelial cells.
Okay.
And it's anticoagulant. So in areas where you have nitric oxide, there's no blood clotting going on.
I see.
That's very important, because if you have damage, you want a clot to form to not bleed to death.
Right, right.
And so, but you don't want the clot to form over the entire vessel, right? Only that spot. And so that's why if you have like a damaged area, but around the area, the endothelial cells are healthy, they actually produce nitric oxide. And so that's why you have the blood clot only in that specific area.
I see.
And not over the entire blood vessel.
Got it.
If that makes sense. Okay, so, you see, I'm
with you.
Going left and right, and it's maybe it's like too much at once, but all these details seem to be important for me. So I'm trying my best not to go too far, but it's
no, you're doing a great job.
Okay, thank you. So you have where did we stop? Yeah, exactly. We're talking about blood clotting basically. So you have that clotting cascade, and you have repeating damage through smoking. Exactly, we're talking about smoking and air particles. You have repeated damage over and over, or blood sugar spikes in that regard, like whatever. High blood sugar is just as damaging. It damages, by the way, high blood sugar is especially damaging to the glycocalyx.
Oh, wow.
And if you have damage to the glycocalyx, then you have other components of the blood being directly exposed to the endothelium. And that can in turn now damage the endothelium. And now we have, again, damage to the endothelium. Second step is clot formation. And if the body is not able to remove the clot quickly enough, then the body, then you have like the clot growing inside of that artery. And this is a very bad thing, because it cannot just fall off as it happens on the skin. Because what happens if it falls off? If it falls off, it can travel down the bloodstream and get stuck somewhere. And now you have a stroke.
Yeah.
Okay. Exactly. So what happens then is there's a certain group of cells which are called the endothelial progenitor cells. As the name implies, they're cells which can become endothelial cells.
Okay.
That's why I call it endothelial progenitor cells. They're actually produced in the bone marrow. And so, there's like many cells produced in the bone marrow, also immune cells. It's actually an immune organ, so your bone marrow.
Awesome.
And so you have these endothelial progenitor cells coming to that damaged area and actually covering the blood clot. And now you have a blood clot in the artery wall. It's covered by new endothelial cells. So, and that's basically what Kendrick describes. Again, to summarize all that, it's damage to the endothelium or to the glycocalyx or both.
Okay.
Different things. We can name a few. It's like smoking, it can be air pollution, it can be high blood pressure, right?
Okay.
It can be high blood glucose. It can be, there's a molecule that's called homocysteine. That's been found to also being able to damage the endothelium. It is increased if you have certain deficiencies of B vitamins, for instance. And so, like what happens, stress in that regard fits beautifully in that system, because stress increases cortisol, and cortisol drives insulin resistance, and insulin resistance drives diabetes. And so high cortisol drives diabetes, and that drives heart disease. Then cortisol increases. So during stress, you experience an increase in blood pressure. Blood pressure drives heart disease because it damages the endothelium. And so what we also see in the risk factors, everything that increases the risk for clotting increases your risk of developing heart disease. There are certain conditions, there's certain medical conditions where people have a pathologically small level of a certain clotting factor. I cannot tell you one off the top of my head, but there was one specific clotting factor was almost absent.
Oh, wow.
And so if you have, or not almost absent, but greatly reduced. And so but it's not that big of a deal, because we're not exposed to, that big amount of danger as we were probably over the course of evolution, where we need to fight and we
I see.
had a higher risk of bleeding to death. So
Right,
people
right.
maybe even don't realize that they have that condition.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
protects you from heart disease because it makes your blood less likely to clot.
that makes sense.
Okay, because following that logic, if you now have damage to the endothelium, then you have a clot being, you have repeated damage to the endothelium. That's an important factor to add. You have a clot that builds up in that over that damaged area. Now that clot is being incorporated into the artery wall, and endothelial progenitor cells cover up that clot, and it's being now trapped in the artery wall. And you have some remodeling process of, and because as I said in the beginning, it's like a clot in different stages of repair, because now we have immune cells and other cells coming through the wall and doing stuff with the clot. They like break it down, break it apart, and take up certain substances, and you remain with what is now can be considered as the plaque.
Right, right.
So that's a quick, somewhat inaccurate. I try to make it as accurate as I could. Summary of what. I'm not saying this happens. I'm saying this would just make the most sense. And these processes, they exist in the body. So these are not make-up processes that just Malcolm Kendrick arbitrarily decided that they exist. They actually do exist. And what also we recently discovered, not recently, but in comparison to LDL, that was very recent.
Mhm.
It's the discovery of another lipoprotein that's called, maybe if you're familiar with it, it's LP lipoprotein little a. It's like an LP and then a small a, like not a capital A, but a little a.
Is it the small particle LDL or?
Not really. It is actually the same particle as LDL. So it also carries an Apob protein, which is the marker protein of the LDL. But in addition to that, it does another protein. Okay. And that's what we call the little a protein. So the medical community is very good at coming up with creative names for proteins. So it's the little a, Apo
Gotcha.
little a protein, whatever.
Yeah.
So, and it's like a tail,
Okay.
Like the Apob is like a thing that's being attached really, and the little a is like an additional tail. And okay, that might be very technical, but let me see if you will understand what I will try to explain.
Okay.
So now that LP little a has been shown to be a bigger risk factor for atherosclerosis than LDL. And a pretty much, you could say independent risk factor. Because in LDL, you have many studies where you adjust for triglycerides and HDL, and suddenly there's no correlation anymore. There are things which let the LDL look benign suddenly. But with LP little a, there's like more going on.
Okay.
And let me just for a second take my charging cable, because my laptop is
Go for it.
second. I'll be back in a minute. Because I know my laptop is very quick.
No problem.
I'm still there.
Yes.
Yes, it's working. Okay. Second. Okay, I'm back.
Excellent.
So okay, the LP little a poses a greater risk for developing atherosclerosis for some reason. And so the interesting thing is that it participates in blood clotting. And now the question is how, like it's a lipoprotein, how on earth does it, participate in blood clotting after all? And it has to do with the additional attached protein. And there is a protein. Okay, where do I start so that makes sense? In the end, it increases the blood clot. It makes the blood clot larger.
Okay.
Now, how does it do it? We have the process that's called fibrinolysis. That's like chopping up the blood clot if it's big enough. And you have like always fibrinolysis and blood clotting going on at the same time.
Okay.
So that you have a blood clot forming, but it's not getting too big.
I see.
Because it's like getting too big, you have
Could get stuck.
It can get stuck, you know, it can block the entire artery. So you want some balance.
Right.
And that's where fibrinolysis kicks in. And if the healing process is actually finished, then the clot gets chopped up in pieces as much as possible.
Okay.
And fibrinolysis, one protein which is very important for fibrinolysis is plasmin. And the precursor molecule of plasmin is plasminogen.
Okay.
And so you have a certain enzyme that converts plasminogen into plasmin. That's called plasminogen activator. Okay. Now, the attached protein, the little a, is very, very, very similar in its structure to plasminogen.
Okay.
Now, what happens is the following thing. The LP little a and this tail, which is similar to plasminogen, takes the place of plasminogen, but it gets not converted to plasmin. Does that make sense? So you have less plasmin floating around and less fibrinolysis going on. So the clot is not getting chopped up as much and can get larger.
Ah, okay.
Does that make some sense?
I think so.
Okay, so maybe once again, you have in the normal circumstance, you would have plasminogen being converted to plasmin, and plasmin is necessary for fibrinolysis so that the clot doesn't become too big.
Okay. Yep.
The LP little a takes the place for plasminogen. But the LP little a is not converted to plasmin.
Ah.
It kind of suppresses the enzyme. So if LP little a takes that place, then plasminogen cannot get there. So you have less plasminogen. You have less plasminogen being converted into plasmin.
Okay, I'm not going to try to re-explain it to anybody.
No. You don't have to. So you have less plasmin in the end, which means you have less fibrinolysis, which means you have a bigger blood clot.
Okay.
And so the question can now be, you know, why does the body have LP little a if it's so evil? You know, there can be different explanations for that, but there's certainly a reason. Malcolm Kendrick says it's the reason that we lost our ability to synthesize vitamin C, and vitamin C is needed to actually produce collagen. Collagen is necessary to keep our blood vessels intact. And so, you know, in a case of vitamin C in scurvy, for instance, in case of vitamin C deficiency, it is of benefit to have additional LP little a, right? So that you do not bleed to death. That's basically the evolutionary how do you say benefit, evolutionary advantage. Right, advantage. So that's it. And they're like, I tried to make it as concise, not the right word, as sensible as possible, as correct as I could.
Right.
And there's like many risk factors. And basically you can say everything that increases blood clotting increases your risk of heart disease. Also, you can say almost everything that decreases blood clotting decreases your risk of heart disease.
Okay.
And then you can also say everything that increases nitric oxide decreases the risk of heart disease, because nitric oxide is produced by healthy endothelial cells, and it's anticoagulant. So it reduces blood clotting, and it dilates the blood vessels. So it's a molecule that makes them wider and reduces blood pressure, essentially.
Say yes.
And everything that, right. And everything that reduces blood pressure, everything that reduces nitric oxide increases the risk for heart disease and atherosclerosis. So right.
Thank you so much for that in-depth explanation. On a more surface level and day-to-day activities for our listeners,
right?
Avoid smoking, keep your stress low, try to keep your blood sugar stable, and a few other things we mentioned. But as far as diet is concerned, what should we keep an eye out for? Before
we maybe talk about diet, I want maybe to mention one more aspect which I would or two aspects, which I would find to be maybe even either of similar importance or even more important than diet.
Okay.
And so one of them would be sunlight.
Yeah.
And I've been
Sunlight. Let's talk about sunlight.
increasingly, how do you say, intrigued by the idea that sunlight is something of tremendous health benefit for us.
I would consider it
And
like a nutrient.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like it's absolutely essential for various reasons. But when it comes to heart disease,
I didn't know
that
it plays a
interesting
role in heart disease.
It does, because it produces nitric oxide, funnily enough.
That's awesome.
That's super funny. Right. You have an enzyme that's called nitric oxide synthesis
Okay.
that can produce nitric oxide. That's one part of the equation. And then you have sunlight, which can increase the amount of nitric oxide by releasing nitric oxide from endogenous stores. So you have like stores in your endothelial cells, independent of that enzyme. So just if you go into the sun, get an increase of nitric oxide in the blood vessels.
I love it.
And so it's super fascinating. If you look, there's been a big study done, and I think it was in a Swedish cohort, which looked at life expectancy and sun exposure. And that's such a beautiful study because it showed one remarkable thing. Like, it's absolutely mind-blowing, because if you imagine, like, the conclusion was the following: the regular exposure to sunlight is able to reduce the risk of heart disease to a similar magnitude as quitting smoking.
Wow, that's phenomenal.
Because what they saw was that smokers who were having the highest amount of sun exposure, they were having a similar risk of dying. It's like of all causes now. It's not heart disease. That's all-cause mortality. Smokers with the highest level of sun exposure had the same all-cause mortality as non-smokers with the lowest level of sun exposure.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. So you increase your risk of dying by not going to the sun.
Wow.
To a similar magnitude as smoking.
Wow.
And that's why I find sunlight so important, because you don't see that in diet studies, right? Even in epidemiology. It's like, yeah, in some epidemiological studies, you see like vegetarians living longer, and others you don't see that. But for sunlight, it's like super consistent.
Wow.
And it's very significant. It's not like by a bit. It was like over a period of 5 years, I think.
Incredible.
They had an increased life expectancy of 2.6 years. So it's a big difference. It's a very big difference. And if you look at the entire lifespan, that can manifest itself as a that you will probably live for way longer, especially if you quit smoking in addition to that.
Yeah. No, that's so cool. And more reasons for me to stay in the sun. I'm a big advocate.
Yes, absolutely.
But
well, don't get burned. That's a very important message.
Yeah.
Because I would say the more sunlight, the better. But if you're not used to that, you need to start like in a stepwise fashion. Because actually sun burning is associated with more skin cancer, which makes sense because you destroy the skin, like obviously.
Take it slow.
Which is not the case for just regular sun exposure. Like the evidence is not that clear on sun exposure by itself without causing damage. Being actually the most important thing in causing skin cancer. Like we know UV light can induce cancer, but the sun has to the skin has to be damaged. And so if you get burned, then that's not a particularly good thing.
Agreed.
Right. So that's sunlight. And the second thing that I was going to mention is stress.
Okay.
It's a hugely important thing. And because stress, we have acute stress and we have chronic stress, right? Acute stress can be anything that it can anything from heavy exercise, that's acute stress. It can be cold exposure. It can be something which excites you in the moment for a small period of time, and then you calm down after that.
Right.
I would say these types of stress are beautiful because they make your body more resilient. They make the body adapt. There's like so many things going on. If you just look at exercise, it's like one of the best ways you can prolong your life by a lot.
Environmental hormesis.
So acute stress, environmental hormesis. Absolutely, that's it. And so if you do that, that's a good thing, I would say. Now the problem comes if you, of course, you should not overdo acute stress, because if you have too much acute stress, that can, add up to a more of a chronic stress situation.
Yeah.
And that's why people who train too much, well, they have overtraining and they have too high, they have disruption in their cortisol levels. And so that's not a good thing either.
I'm sure you're familiar with the term allostatic load. It's
right.
basically like your stress threshold for acute stress. If you do too much, it's it's gonna lead to bad things.
Right. And that's where I wouldn't even encourage anyone to necessarily experiment with that edge. So you should be engaging in regular exercise and do as much as you like and do all of the other things. But I would not try to do as much as possible, because then you risk getting too close to that edge and actually stepping over and getting into that chronic stress situation.
Yeah.
But if we now talk about injuries, and actually now the problems that occur with chronic stress, because if you have chronically disrupted cortisol levels, and they usually manifest themselves as being too low in the morning where they should be high, and then too high over the course of the day, which means that your sleep gets also disrupted.
Yeah, it's like the people who always say they're productive at night. I'm like, oh, I'm worried about you.
Yeah, that's right. That's not particularly a good thing, I would suggest. So if that's the case, and then in addition to that, you have, on average, you have increased cortisol levels. Now there's a condition that's called Cushing syndrome. It's where people have a tumor in their head that produces hormones, which now go to the adrenal glands that sit on the kidney and tell them to produce more cortisol. So in Cushing syndrome, the people have an astronomically high cortisol level.
Yikes.
Without even being stressed. It's just because there's a tumor.
Wow.
Right? And so they have really heavy insulin resistance. They have central adiposity. They have catabolism in their muscles. And that's a bad thing, because that itself drives insulin resistance, because you have less muscle to dispose of the glucose, right? That you're eating, because the muscle can store some of the glucose that you consume. And so that's a great example of where cortisol itself is being too high, and the consequences that actually follow. So that's somewhat like what happens if you are on steroid injections, that what people, for instance, take if they have inflammatory diseases.
Okay.
Because cortisol suppresses the immune system. It's what it does. And so that's the reason why stress makes us sick. That's we use cortisol to suppress the immune system in inflammatory diseases. And now imagine you're constantly stressed. Yeah, sure, you'll get sick sooner or later, because you have a suppressed immune system all the time.
Yeah.
And that's what happens if you maybe you've had such things, like you've been stressed and then suddenly you get sick because your immune system is down.
Oh, absolutely. Stressed, low sleep, I'm sick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. And that's one thing. So it suppresses the immune system. It has other effects.
So are you saying that steroid injections have this effect as well? They
increase heart disease, the risk of heart disease.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. And it's because it drives cortisol, which suppresses immune system. Well,
it suppresses immune system. It increases insulin resistance for various reasons, because cortisol is usually secreted when you're in a stressful situation, right? So the body needs substrates to burn energy, because you need to run away from a tiger or whatever. Or nowadays it's mostly you have an exam or something benign, but
more
still you have
stress.
Psychological, but still the body doesn't really recognize the difference.
Yeah,
so it reacts the same way. You have an increase in blood pressure and all that. And so the body liberates substrates. It liberates fatty acids. It liberates glucose.
Right.
And so if you have an increased liberation of glucose, it will be followed by an increased insulin level. And so a chronically increased insulin level itself can induce insulin resistance.
I see.
That by itself. Now that can also drive hunger. because if you're stressed, your other hormone systems also get disrupted. It's a very complicated system, like endocrinology, and I don't know anything by all means. Like by all means, like I'm just in my second year. It's the things that I've read and the things that we've already gone through in medical school. But cortisol affects the body on every level, basically.
Wow.
And it throws the body out of balance, because it is not the norm that you run away from a tiger. It's like, yeah, if that happens, you need to be prepared. And you don't feel pain. That's what also happens. You don't feel hunger. You don't feel that you're sick. You don't feel anything. It doesn't really matter. It also increases blood clotting, because what if you run away from a tiger and cut yourself? You should not bleed to death. What if you're in a fight? You need to fight.
Yeah.
And you can be hurt badly, and you don't want to bleed to death. So stress increases blood clotting. It increases insulin resistance over the long term. That does not happen acutely. That happens over the long term. And all that together obviously drive heart disease. And it fits beautifully in that whole system and model that Malcolm Kendrick proposes.
Wow. Yeah, I think in society
It's
today,
a lot, I'm sorry.
no, we're always just operating in that being chased by a lion state of mind. And it really is so hazardous to our health. And I feel like it's often underrated what a huge role stress plays. Like, I feel like we're just like, oh yeah, everyone's stressed. Like, oh yeah, I'm stressed. Everyone's stressed. And we just normalize it. But it's taking a real physiological toll on us. And
it is.
Yeah. So, and I probably would have been this person a few years back saying like, oh, get a massage. Like, what's that going to do for my health? Like, or like hang out in the sun for an hour, do some breath work and some meditation. I'd be like, no, the real meat and potatoes is getting good nutrition. And that's have been like my main focus. But nowadays I'm all about keeping my stress low and making sure my cortisol is nice and low. So yeah, I think it's,
and so we've been so myopically focused on nutrition all the time. And also I know how I have been the over the past few years that I've been I've become more and more interested in this space. And so, we talk, there are all these debates about nutrition, but in the end, I must admit that we are able to thrive and survive on, almost all diets except for a vegan diet, funnily enough.
Or a processed food diet.
Well, for sometimes we're maybe able to survive, because there are people who do that their entire lives and somehow they seem to get along, but it's obviously it's not optimal. Absolutely.
True.
So, and you can, if it leads to all kinds of diseases. So it makes us sick, obviously.
Right.
But what I mean is that you're probably familiar with the work of Weston Price, I suppose.
Yes.
And so he's been traveling the world and looking at different societies and looking at how they eat and how their teeth are. And so he has observed that they had very different diets depending on where they lived and what they had access to. And they had all beautiful teeth and no tooth decay and no actually degenerative chronic diseases, as they were happening more and more often in
no
civilized societies. Sorry?
And no toothpaste, but their teeth were
yes.
Or braces.
So that's maybe like more like visual thing, like that the teeth look nice. But to make them healthy, you need to consume the right foods.
Right.
So yeah, that's another argument for not eating processed foods, obviously. And that would be my very first thing to advise people to do, like cut out if it's processed, if it's industrially processed. Like that's a very important nuance, because difference, because dairy is processed, but it's a process method that actually adds value to the product and not decreases its nutritional value.
What is processed, did you say?
Dairy, like milk products.
Oh, dairy.
Processed milk products.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dairy. If you make kefir, if you make cheese, if you make yogurt, if you make, what else can we make of it? Like all these things, they make the food more nutritious as opposed to less nutritious, as it happens with industrially processed food, right?
That's a
difference, a caveat we need to make.
Yep.
And so what he observed, they had different diets. There were no vegans, so obviously. So I think we don't have to have this discussion. So I think we can agree that veganism is not optimal for different reasons. But the amount of animal foods varied. There was always a focus on the animal foods, but it varied. The amount of plant foods varied. The type of animal foods and plant foods varied. So I think diet plays a role. If you adhere to these two, I would say, most important principles. First one would be cut out processed food and eat only natural foods, or processed in a way that increases its nutritional value, as fermenting, or like cooking, like it's a form of processing.
Yep.
But it's not bad.
Yeah.
And so the second thing would be, I would say, focus on animal nutrition, because it provides the most amount of bioavailable nutrients to the body.
Absolutely.
And now you can decide how much. Focus doesn't mean you need to eat only animal foods, or even most of the diet should animal foods, but it means that you should keep an eye on not excluding them at all costs. So keeping them at the highest quality and having them in basically all your meals. That's what I would say. But now you can decide what you like. If you like to have like more plants, less animals, or more animal foods and less plant foods, that's up to you. Because I think for long-term health, for heart disease and all that, it probably doesn't make that big of a difference. There are like other factors that are way, way more powerful, like sunlight, like stress, and this is connected to sleep and probably exercise. I would think these 4 factors are way more powerful than diet, if you actually follow the principles that I just explained. I think if that's the case, then you're great to go.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And those are all lifestyle factors that are in our control. Sure. And
that's it.
Yeah. And you can see it with the modern tribes today that are being like sidelined. They're like taking out of their normal location and like kind of shuffled somewhere else and being provided food because they can't hunt and whatnot. And you can see a drastic decrease in their health.
Right.
But yeah,
and that's funny because people now try to say that, look at the Eskimos, they now have a similar level of heart disease as the white population. Well, yeah, they now have access to the foods that we're eating, and they and they now lead a similar lifestyle as white people, and they have an additional stress factor, by the way, which increases blood clotting, which is cold. So cold increases blood clotting.
Oh wow.
Which also makes sense, because if you are exposed to very cold temperature, you usually, the body doesn't differentiate between stress situations, as we said. If it's psychological stress, if it's cold, if it's a fight, it's like always the same reaction. You have increased blood pressure, increased cortisol, increased adrenaline, and increase in blood clotting, just in case that you might hurt yourself, so that you do not bleed to death.
Yeah, I didn't know the blood clotting aspect.
It's like not being looked at. I would say extensively enough. And I fear that if maybe someone in the future, they finally realize that that's kind of the most important issue, that they will now try everything to invent like new drugs to reduce like blood clotting or whatnot. Like I think that's not the right way to go about it. So you should obviously first try to work on the things that are in your control.
Right, more preventive.
That actually solve the problem, right? And not just work on the symptoms.
Yeah.
On the symptomology of disease.
Or prevent it from ever happening.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But you can only solve the problem if you work on the root causes, right? Because the pathology actually stays the same. You just maybe mitigate one tiny factor. You know, stress, like if you have stress, if you have all these bad risk factors, they drive heart disease in various ways. And now you like tackle one thing and reduce blood clotting. That won't do anything crazy about your heart disease risk. It's only if you really work on the root causes and try to optimize your health in that way.
Yeah, and it's the reason why people who go to the hospital continue to go to the hospital, because they're getting band-aids and not root cause treatment.
It's very unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. It's sad.
It is, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I know we wanted to talk a little bit more about exercise, but I don't know if you want to save it for another episode or if you want to continue. I don't know how much time you have.
Well, we're probably not going to go too deep into like exercise. There's actually not that much. You could talk a lot about exercise, obviously.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
like a fascinating rabbit hole. Like 10 more podcasts.
Yeah.
But what I would say is the more important message to take out of it is that first, people should just find a type of movement that's appealing to them, that they like. So you don't have to do anything that people force you to do. You don't have to go jogging, like, or go to the gym or anything. Just find a way to move your body.
So true.
And that would be good enough. Like if you do that, I'm so proud of you guys. If you find just a way to move your body that you find enjoyable. And if you want to take it to the next level, well, there's a lot of evidence that a certain combination of a good amount of strength training and a good amount of endurance activity that actually greatly reduces the risk of, many conditions, and independent of weight loss, by the way. So if you just engage in physical activity, that reduces your risk for literally everything, like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. In that regard, doesn't matter if you lose weight or not. So it's a very powerful tool. Again, you should not overdo it. You can overdo it, obviously. And I would encourage just everyone to find, again, the type of physical activity that you enjoy and can continue to do forever, basically. You can switch it up, and I like switching things up. It's like playground. You should play. It should be fun, right? It shouldn't be stressful, because that's an additional factor of stress, which again increases your risk of dying. So find a way so that it's fun. Your body will have that acute stress response, and you will have that environmental hormesis effect, as you mentioned, that beautiful term. But it still will be fun. It will not pose additional mental stress on you. If you force yourself to go to the gym, that's a very bad thing.
Right. And we want to add more play. So
sure,
movement is my favorite way to play. So yeah, everyone find something that you love to do with moving your body that feels playful and doesn't feel like a burden to your day-to-day lives already.
Right. That's what I would say to exercise. But you can obviously go a lot deeper into things that happen during exercise.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Maxim. Where can our listeners find you?
My pleasure. My audience is still relatively small, even though I do not really care about it that much. So I'm happy if people listen to what I say, find maybe if one person listens to what I say and finds some value, I'm happy. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, and one listener is going to spread the message to someone else who maybe didn't listen.
That's such a powerful message.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect.
It's very, and I've been listening to Jordan Peterson over the past few weeks. I've been really immersing myself into his work, because for some reason I found it super fascinating. And he's exactly talking about that. People oftentimes have that nihilistic view of the world, always saying things like, what I do doesn't really matter. Well, it does, because as you just explained, if you just work on yourself, that will have an impact on how people perceive you, the impact you have on other people, not by necessarily imposing your opinion on them or trying to convince them of something, but just by living your life by example, as you said in the beginning. Actually, this way you have an impact on people. Yeah, and you most likely have a positive impact on people if you put your life together and take responsibility for your own things. Then you start influencing other people, and it's like a chain reaction. They now you are in contact with, I don't know, 100, 200, whatever people over the course of a month or two, and so these people now have an impact on the folks they are talking to.
Absolutely. No, it goes back to quantum physics. When we live according to our truest self and our truest health, essentially, it changes our the energy we emit, which is our vibrational frequency.
Oh yeah.
Other people, whether they know it or not, can absolutely feel that, and they pick
Sure.
up on it, and it changes the way they feel as well, which continues to change the
Yes.
way the people they're around feel. So it's powerful. It's powerful. It's something we can't see, and
No.
but it's something that exists and it is real in the universe.
And I think podcasts are in that regard a great way to engage in, you know, in great meaningful conversations with people. And that way, you know, people can learn, people can listen if they want to. They can, I mean, we learn. I mean, I've learned a lot because I've just by telling that story of what we were talking about, you know, I've not only been going through these processes, but I've been at the same time, of course, like questioning, does that make sense now? Yes, it does. Or does that make sense now? Yes, it probably does. And trying to find now loopholes again of where maybe there is room for improvement of that whole model.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
That's why I also decided to start my own podcast, because as we've been talking before we started recording, actually, why it's so beautiful to having your own podcast, because you don't just consume content all the time, but you actually create valuable and useful content for other people, just following the concept that we just alluded to. And so yeah, you can find my podcast, I think, almost everywhere. I'm not sure about that. So just it's definitely on Spotify. Like I'm not sure if it's on Apple Podcasts, actually. I need to check that. But Sapiens Playground, I have a relatively small YouTube channel where I post the video versions of my podcasts. And yeah, I'm on Instagram. That's basically where I'm most active. And,
Okay.
My handle is monkey_Kelly Playground. So it's you can probably just put a link in the description.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, well, the Twitter handle is not that important because I use it not for basically getting new people or audience, but still, like I'm on Twitter. It's at let me remember what my Twitter handle was. Like I'll send you the link.
Okay.
I'll just send you the link because I don't remember my Twitter handle.
That's okay.
Yeah, I think I'm very one more thing, which it's my link tree, because I'm very happy to have that link tree, because I'm putting links to PDFs and free versions of, you know, books and stuff. Awesome. That I just want people to read, because I'm not a big fan of, you know, selling things, because that can make people question the validity of what I actually say, if that's really true and, you know, reliable. Right. So that's why I'll just send you the link to my link tree and people can go there. And it's just a collection of, and I constantly add new things to that link tree, which I like. So it's like, if I find a free PDF version of a book that I find interesting, that I put it there in the link tree, so that people, and if I find, and if I actually found that book to be helpful, then I just hope that maybe someone will read that book and also find it helpful.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing.
Link. That's probably going to be it with the links. Yeah.
Awesome. I'll link everything up in the show notes. So I think the biggest take home message is, you know, what we do absolutely matters and has an effect on everyone around us and the bigger picture. Thank you again, Maxim.
Absolutely.
I'll see you on the other side.
It's been my pleasure to talk to you. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure to have you.